All right, guys, so welcome to the second video in this series for desert biology. In this video, we're going to take a look at animal adaptations, okay? So, survival for animals, survival is actually based on kind of two adaptation approaches, yeah? The first being that of a drought resistor, having adaptations that allow them to tolerate those extreme conditions that we mentioned in the last video. So that is the kind of stay and fight approach. And then there is also the drought evader, which is having adaptations that allows the animal to then avoid those extreme conditions, or a leave and come back kind of approach. Okay, and so there's a variety of different things that animals can do, and so here's a short table to kind of outline some of those things. Being nocturnal, if you want to avoid the daytime heat, get out at night. Concentration of urine to increase the reabsorption of water by the kidneys. A lot of animals are in the desert are able to do that. Gaining their water from their food, so actually getting the moisture out of the food as much as possible. Reducing things that are making them prone to lose water, like sweat glands, slowing down their metabolic rate so they don't use up as much energy, and then also creating drought-resistant eggs that allows those offspring to survive. Drought evasion can include things like migration, getting out and migrating to a different place, or perhaps burrowing and being dormant during the harsh conditions, and then only coming out when the conditions become favorable, like rain and so forth. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these animals. It's probably the easiest way for me to kind of identify these adaptations is to give you actual examples of organisms and how they actually adapt to living. So here's a kind of general overview of some of the animals that you are going to find living in the Australian desert. Okay, the one in the top left hand corner is the thorny devil. So you can actually see there those little kind of thorn and spiky kind of skin that the thorny devil actually has. Interestingly, it's not really a self-defense mechanism as such. The spikes, what it actually does, it allows the thorny devil to increase surface area and collect moisture. And so what that actually does is when you kind of get dew forming at nighttime and moisture levels that kind of drop below a certain temperature turns back into water, it actually the increased surface area allows the thorny devil to actually collect that moisture into a liquid water, which it can then use to hydrate itself. So pretty amazing adaptation if you think about it, and one that allows it to resist the conditions of the drought. You'll find bilbies. Now, bilbies are quite endangered, but nonetheless, they used to be widespread. But since the introduction of animals like foxes and things like that, the numbers have been severely reduced. Yeah, so you can see bilbies actually have these really large ears, right? So one of the adaptations that bilbies have is that by having a really large ears, not only can it hear really well, which is pretty efficient, but also the ears are filled with these blood vessels that can send blood up to the ears when the weather gets really hot, and when the blood goes up to the ears, it releases the heat from the blood, cooling down the animal. This is a pretty familiar lizard, the goanna, or otherwise known as the parente, which is pretty much the largest species of monitor lizard in Australia. And so, you know, being particularly large helps it be able to kind of survive in this kind of desert environment. And also being a reptile, a lot of reptiles are found in desert environments because reptiles, the skin doesn't contain a lot of sweat glands, and also the skin blocks like kind of water loss from evaporation. So a lot of reptiles are found in the desert because they have those adaptations. And also being an ectotherm, a cold-blooded organism, means that they don't require as much energy from their food, which means they feed a little less frequently, which is really useful because living in the desert, you don't really find food all that often, okay? The largest terrestrial mammal that is native to Australia is the red kangaroo. So you can see this little big brute there. Now, kangaroos are a marsupial species, the largest of the marsupial species, and actually female kangaroos have this very special adaptations allowing them to survive in the desert, in that they can actually halt pregnancy. So, you know, when the mother is carrying a baby, what she can actually do is she can actually hold off the process of I guess being pregnant during until the conditions are actually right for her to actually carry a baby during, when the rains come and the conditions are favorable. And then on top of that, what they can actually do is rather than gestating inside the body and allowing the embryo to turn into a fetus and grow, marsupials can actually give birth to really tiny babies that are kind of in your embryonic stage, but they're actually outside the body already. And so those little embryos, the gestation happens outside of the body, and so if the conditions get really bad and the babies die, the mothers can actually produce a new baby fairly quickly in comparison to, say, a placental mammal, which has to then carry the baby inside the womb. And so that needs to happen regardless of the environmental conditions. So that's also another special adaptation. The dingo, a very, very significant cultural icon, been here for, literally thousands of years, is one of the few placental mammals that live in Australia. And interestingly, most likely did not originate in Australia, but were actually brought here alongside humans. So you can say that it is a bit of an introduced species, but it's been around for so long that it's become part of the natural ecosystem. A lot of people reckon that the introduction of the dingo coincided with the extinction of the Tasmanian tiger, which was used to be found in mainland Australia, but then they reckon that the dingo outcompeted the Tasmanian tiger as the apex predator in this particular environment. So there you go. Nice little interesting fact for you guys. And then the wedge-tailed eagle. So the largest bird in Australia with a significant wingspan of upwards of 3 to 3.2 meters, and found pretty much all over Australia and Papua New Guinea. You can see there that they have a really large habitat range, and a very, very powerful predator with the kind of the beak, the hooked beak and keen eyesight and large wingspan and these strong talons designed to grasp prey from a distance. Okay, so let's talk about a few other examples and actually hone in on some of the adaptations. So let me introduce you to the Spinifex hopping mouse, or otherwise known as the takawara. And you can see here the Spinifex hopping mouse is a very key species that exemplifies what the adaptations of desert organisms would look like. Okay, so ways that the mouse gets water into its body include, metabolic water that the mouse produces when it breaks down food, water from the food that it eats, like seeds and plants and so forth, and then also maybe the few water that it actually does get from the rain. And then once it gets that water in, it's got a variety of different adaptations that allows it to keep the water in its body and not lose too much of it. Yeah. So for example, a lot of water is drawn out of its food, and so there's very minimal water loss in feces. Loss in urine may be as little as a drop per day. So if you think about it, it releases so few water that it's pretty much peeing out solid urine, right, which is pretty phenomenal. Evaporation from the skin, this can be minimized by a behavioral adaptation of burrowing and living inside these burrows, because the environment in the burrows are much more stable than that outside the burrow. And then also it's got a nasal heat exchange up in the nose that allows it to reduce the amount of moisture that the mouse loses every time it exhales. And whenever you exhale, a bit of moisture from your lungs gets released out of your breath and into the air. The mouse can reduce this by having a nasal heat exchange up here, allowing it to breathe out dry, cold air better than kind of our warm air, right? On top of that, they have these kidney tubules, particularly this particular structure inside the kidneys called the loop of Henle, which is designed to reabsorb water. And so the Spinifex hopping mouse, their loop of Henle is proportionate to the rest of the kidney, is one of the longest of any organism in the world, which allows it to reabsorb so much water that it pretty much produces solid urine, right? It also has a few behavioral things. So for example, instead of eating the seeds that it gets, what it does is it actually buries the seed deep in these burrows, and so by being buried, the seeds actually gain moisture from its environment, and so when the mouse eats the seed, it gains that moisture from the ground as well. And then it also it gains water from its food source, like insects and plants, and its metabolic water. Yeah, you can see the range that the Spinifex hopper mouse occupies reaches all around those desert regions. And as the name suggests, it lives in the kind of Spinifex environment. Okay, examples of dormancy. This is the Trilling Frog. And, you know, for most amphibians, including frogs, they actually need to live in a very moist environment because amphibians can breathe through their skin, right? And so if you can breathe through the skin, the advantage is obviously you're not so reliant on your lungs, and you can kind of live in more of a moist / aquatic environment. But the disadvantage is that in dry environments, the skin will lose moisture very rapidly. And so amphibians aren't really designed to live in desert environments. But for the Trilling Frog, they can live by being dormant and burying themselves below the ground, undergoing this state of dormancy until the rain comes. And how it does that is that there's a mucus lining that covers the skin that creates this kind of hard shell, almost like an eggshell that prevents any moisture from going in and out of it. And so it buries itself, covers itself in this mucus that prevents water loss, and then it goes dormant and shutting down all of its vital functions until the rain comes. And when the rain comes, the mucus lining breaks, and then the frog comes out, and then it goes through its entire life cycle, eating, mating, and giving birth to tadpoles, all in that span of when the water comes, and then it buries itself and goes dormant again for the next season. So you can see they're kind of living life one season at a time, right? Examples of drought evasion other than dormancy can also include moving around. So a lot of birds take advantage of this because being a bird means you can fly and you can avoid a harsh condition by simply flying over to the next place that is now showing favorable conditions. And so birds in particular will migrate fairly frequently. And so budgies, for example, will always travel to cooler parts of the day to find favorable areas with water and food, and then return during different seasons during the year, right? And so moving around is a very efficient method of doing that. Okay. Now, for some organisms, kind of escaping the harsh environment isn't really an option. So instead of trying to ensure an individual survival, what it does is actually ensures the survival of the species. And so brine shrimps, otherwise known as sea monkeys, if you ever kept sea monkeys, you're probably familiar with this, right? You kind of get them in these packets, and all you got to do is you put water in them, and then you just kind of watch them come to life, right? This is what a little brine shrimp looks like. They are a crustacean, right? And what they do is that before the lake kind of dries up, what they do is they create these, they give birth to these eggs, and these eggs are highly drought resistant, right? And they can survive for up to 20 years without any sort of water supply. Which is why you get them in these little dried up packets, right? And the drought-resistant eggs will then hatch when the rains come, and within the span of the couple of weeks that the rain is available, the brine shrimp will grow from egg to grow up to be an adult, reproduce and produce new eggs, all within those 3 weeks, and then adults then die, and then the eggs will then survive in these drought conditions for however long it takes before the next season of rain comes. So you can see there another efficient way to ensure survival of the species rather than survival of the individual. Okay, here's another example. So you guys might not know this, but actually the country with the highest population of wild camels in the world is actually Australia. Australia has more wild camels than any other country in the world, and camels are not native. They are introduced from overseas, right? And they are basically the masters of desert living, right? So they've got a whole host of different adaptations that allows them to live in the desert. For example, having a double row of eyelashes to protect the eyes and the nose from sand. They have bony structures that absorb air from the exhaled air that they get in order to be able to gain moisture from the air. Their red blood cells can kind of almost be squashed together and become really thin, so that when the blood dries up, it can still transmit or transfer oxygen in the red blood cells. The humps of the camels, they're not actually storing water. What they do is they store fat, and the storage of fat allows the camel to then metabolize and break down the fat, and one of the byproducts of metabolism is water, allowing the camel to then use the water that it's broken down from the fat. The camel has concentrated urine, like most organisms living in the desert, which they can then kind of pee into their own leg to cool them down during the heat of the day. They have an elongated colon, which releases dry feces, absorbing as much moisture from the feces as possible. And then also they have a high tolerance range from 34 to 42 degrees of core temperature, which means they don't really need to sweat to kind of regulate the body temperature or anything like that. So you can see they're a master of living in the desert. Okay. All right. So that's it for the animal adaptations. Next lesson, we're going to look at plant adaptations. Okay. I'll see you guys then.